This is the CRM, where you can see your customer contracts and their commercial rules. You can also see produced invoices. They appear as links to the generated invoices. Now let's open a customer. This customer is related to the hierarchy diagram we saw earlier. Here we are on the customer summary screen. On this screen, you can see all contracts related to this customer. You can also see which tenant or billing issuing entity the contract is related to. There is general information about the customer, such as contract list, address, diary, other related information. Since there is only one contract, we can navigate directly to it. The system then opens the contract summary screen, where the main contract information is displayed. Here you can track information associated specifically with this contract. As you can see, this contract contains 2 product offers. These offers are based on the game's offer template that was configured earlier in the product catalog. That template was used when this contract was created. Now regarding configuration levels, the system supports multiple levels where calculation rules can be defined. At the highest level, we have the generic offer level. At this level, you can define the overall calculation model. For example, whether the calculation is based on NGR or GGR. What is included in the bonus base? What is included in the bet and win base? You can also define the tax base. You specify the base first, and then, depending on the country linked to the contract, the system applies the relevant tax percentage and any defined cap. After defining the calculation model at the generic offer level, we can move to a lower level inside the product structure. For example, we open standard games. At this level, we can define a specific calculation model that applies only to this part of the offer. So instead of applying one generic percentage to all games, we can apply tier logic specifically for standard games. Now, if we move to another level, for example branded games, we can define a different calculation logic. Here, instead of tiers, we may define a flat percentage, for example 9.5%. We can also specify whether negative revenue is allowed or not. So for branded games, the configuration can be flat rate, negative allowed flag set to yes or no, separate bonus handling if needed. The important point is that each sub-level can override the configuration defined at the higher level. If no specific rule is defined at the lower level, the system applies the parent configuration. But once a rule is defined here, it overrides the generic offer settings. This allows you to define one model for all games, a different model for standard games, another model for branded games, and even more granular logic if required, all within the same contract. Now let's look at a more complex example, a customer that is part of a group agreement. In this case, the calculation is not defined only at the individual product or contract level. Instead, we introduce a higher configuration layer, the group calculation setup. Here, the royalty calculation model can be defined for the entire group. For example, instead of calculating revenue per specific game type, we can calculate based on the overall aggregated revenue of the group. This allows revenue from multiple packages or contracts to be combined and evaluated together. At the same time, other parameters, such as bonus basis or tax basis, remain aligned with the contract configuration. Now, once the contract configuration is completed, including group calculation rules and tier setup, we also support full change control and audit tracking. From the contract level, we can move to the processes section and open change management. Here, the system allows reviewing and approving any changes made to customer contracts or commercial rules. If we open the changes view, we can see a complete history of modifications. What was changed, which parameter was updated, previous and new values, date of change, user who made the change. For example, you can see updates to calculation model, e.g., NGR to tier, revenue thresholds, scale percentages, minimum guarantees, tax basis, bonus basis, common rate adjustments. This ensures full transparency, compliance support, 4 Eyes approval principle, Complete auditability before billing. Only approved changes are applied to the billing process. So before each bill run, you have full control and visibility over what has been modified, and by whom. In addition to managing contracts directly in the CRM interface, the system also supports bulk configuration and review via Excel. Here, we see a structured export of contract data. Each tab corresponds to a product or game type, and the columns reflect the commercial rules configured in the system. Now let's discuss configuration flexibility inside the system. The presenter demonstrates how properties can be adjusted directly from the interface, using the example of modifying the bonus base configuration. The key point shown here is that configuration changes are handled through the same UI and can be controlled by permissions and user roles. A new value is added to a lookup list, and once configuration changes are applied, the new value immediately becomes available across formulas and calculation logic. Now let's switch to one of the customers and see how this configuration appears in the actual contract setup. We open the customer search and select the existing customer. From the customer summary, we navigate into the contract and open the configuration screens. This allows us to verify how the extended value becomes available inside real commercial setup. Inside calculation setup, we open the bonus basis field. Here you can see that the extended lookup values are already available. After configuration changes are saved, new values become immediately accessible across the system, including calculation setup and formulas. If needed, formula rules can also be updated to define how the system should behave when this new value is selected. Now let's move to the basic setup section. Here we can see additional parameters that control how calculations behave, including customer overrides. Before moving to file processing, let me clarify one frequently asked option: allow customer amount. Normally, values such as tax, bonus, or deductions are calculated automatically by the system. However, depending on contract rules, the customer may be allowed to submit their own calculated amounts. In this case, the system can either overwrite the internal calculation or apply configured rules, for example choosing minimum or maximum values based on defined logic. This gives flexibility when customer-provided financial data needs to be respected while still maintaining system control. Once configuration is defined, the next step is processing incoming transaction data. Input gaming transactions may arrive in different formats, typically Excel or CSV files. These files can contain different numbers of columns or different structures. The data is then mapped through the system's mapping layer so that it fits the internal product format used for calculations. We've shown how values like customer amounts can be configured. Now we are moving to the next step, the input data and gaming transactions. The transaction file can come in different formats. It may be an Excel or CSV file, and the structure can vary: different columns, different layouts, different sources. Because of that, the file goes through our EDR mapping layer, where it is transformed into the format used internally by the system. This is the configuration layer that defines how incoming data from external files will be interpreted and mapped into the system structure. If we use direct API integration, this part can be simplified or even skipped, but for file-based processing this is the default and most common approach. Here is an example of the original transaction file. The file can contain a different number of columns depending on the source. During mapping, the system takes only the required fields and converts them into the internal format used for calculations and reporting. So this step basically defines how data from your original file is mapped into the product model inside the system. Now let's briefly look at the taxation setup. Inside the administration section, taxes are configured centrally and can be maintained per country. Here we define the generic tax values that are used by default during calculations. If a specific customer or contract requires different values, these defaults can be overridden at a lower level of configuration. Additional taxes can also be configured when required, for example country-specific or temporary taxes. So the taxation setup works as a centralized configuration that supports both global defaults and customer-level overrides. In addition to standard VAT or simple tax calculation, the system also supports dedicated processes for regulatory or taxation documents. These processes are handled within the same solution and use the same data model, but they are executed separately from the normal billing run.